Let's talk about grief from a psychological illusion model perspective. Someone recently asked me, how does this whole psychological illusion model apply to people who may be struggling with grief? And I thought that's a pretty good answer. So, by the way, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis Vlog. So I thought I would offer some reflections on grief and how I work with clients and from a psychological illusion model perspective. So when people ask questions such as how does the psychological illusion model apply to grief, for most people, things like grief or anxiety or anger or compulsions, look like different things that different methods or techniques can then treat or help to manage or work on. I don't view things like that at all. The way it looks to me, grief is entirely made of thought. And a nice analogy for this is imagine an ice cream bar where you can get chocolate ice cream, you can get vanilla ice cream, you can get mango or strawberry, or, these are all different flavors of ice cream, but they are all fundamentally ice cream. So when people talk about anxiety, depression, grief, to me, these are all different shapes or flavors of the thinking process taking form, so to speak. It's all thought generated, 100%. Now, when I work with a client for grief, these are typically people who have been stuck with grief for a long time, meaning I never work with people who have just lost someone, who are, acutely, they lost their loved one last night or last week. Those are not the situations or folks that I work with. The people I work with are people who might call and say, look, I lost my spouse 5 years ago, and it's still completely raw, or I'm just stuck in grief. I can't move on. I have all this emotional pain. And when people like that come in, I tend to just do what I call psychoeducation, meaning I don't talk with them about grief necessarily that much, but I guide them through thought experiments. I share stories, analogies. I help them discover the illusory nature of thought. And I help them to make a distinction between thinking and being. And as a result of this, way more often than not, people then tend to discover that that old stuck grief is either no longer being generated because they've had an insight into the nature of their own experience, or even if it does, it doesn't look as real. It doesn't bother them in the same way anymore. So that's one thing, one aspect in this. Now, I would also like to say that, I think when people. Oh, let me offer this too. Something else that's important to point out is that even if someone says that they experience grief, we don't necessarily mean what they're referring to. They may mean something quite different than what you might mean or what I might mean when we use the word grief. So, most people tend to think that when people use a word like depression or anxiety or grief, that they can just kind of take that word and track their own experience and know what the other person is talking about. But there is no there really are no universal emotions in that sense. There isn't one anxiety. There isn't a If we take anxiety as an example, there isn't a unique facial expression for anxiety. There's no neural circuit in the brain that lights up with anxiety. There's no particular signature in the body that lights up with anxiety. And the same goes with grief. There's not one grief. Two people who both describe grief can describe quite different experiences. So that's something else to be aware of. And of course, grief isn't something to be treated. It's not a disease. It's not a it's a label for a set of experiences, some thoughts and feelings that the person has. So one thing that I've learned to do when people come in and let's say they talk about a loss in their life, or someone's committed suicide, or they've lost a child or something like that, what I've learned to do is to just stay completely present with the person and just center and ask the person, what's your experience around this? Because it's so easy to assume that the person must be, experiencing tremendous grief or despair, or the things you would expect. But sometimes people come to see you because they don't have the typical response that their culture tells them that they should have. They might not have much of a grief response at all, and they might be faking it socially, or thinking that something must be wrong with them for not having that particular response, and they may be deeply disturbed about what they think that means about them. So let's say, for example, if someone has lost a child or a partner, if I automatically go into empathy mode and I assume that this must be devastating for them, if this is one of those clients who doesn't have an experience resembling that, or they experience something very different, I've just completely lost them. So the reality is, even in the case of a dead child, or a spouse that's died, or someone who has left them, or people can have a range of different experiences and you just don't know. And sometimes people seek out help due to not having the types of experiences they think they should be having, or they have very different experiences from that, right? And they think that implies or means something about them. So then we can explore that and help someone to see how that is made up of thought or thinking, and help someone see its illusory nature. Um, there might also be, let me offer this too. In the case of people, having acutely lost someone, um, people may have a wide variety of experiences around that too. I don't tend to think that coaches and therapists are very useful in that phase. I don't think seeing someone in the acuteness of loss, so to speak, is usually very useful. I think that family support and friend support is typically, the way to go. Losing people, people dying, relationships ending. This is the game of life, and this used to be something that, and it still is, of course, but it used to be more something that friends and families and communities dealt with through rituals and as a natural part of life. And now increasingly it's become medicalized and kind of outsourced and thought of as something to be treated or worked on or dealt with by a professional or as a therapist. I think that this is mostly a mistake. And I'll I'll offer this isn't quite the same, but it's kind of relevant and related. There's this method called debriefing that's often been used with the Red Cross, firefighters, police officers, correctional officers, emergency medical personnel. After some sort of very dramatic event, the whole idea is for them to, as soon as possible, go to this debriefing session where they spend a lot of time verbally expressing every detail of that. And it's been believed for decades that this was useful. And the tricky part too is that a lot of the people who went through debriefing has praised it, and many of the people who have been involved in debriefing have praised it. But then the meta studies started coming out, where they do control groups who don't go through a debriefing, and you go through and you have other people who do go through the debriefing. And what the meta studies show clearly is that not only is the debriefing not useful, it's counterproductive. The people in the debriefing groups suffer way more on a group level later on than the people who haven't gone through debriefing. So it seems as if grief is often one of those kind of adaptive responses that it's very natural to have a perception of loss if you lose someone or something, or something in life doesn't go as you wanted. And over time, most people will adapt, and especially with good help from family and friends. And it seems as if having these kind of therapeutic interventions kind of frees up or freezes up that natural healing process, so to speak. So I'd be very skeptical to work with people for grief in an acute phase. And a lot of people also are scared of what they call grief. They're scared of their own inner experience. So the way you could help someone, as a family member or as a friend, is by being completely present with someone and being fearless. Meaning, if you understand the nature of thoughts and the thinking feeling connection, if you've seen its illusory nature and you're not afraid of your own experience, you're not afraid of thoughts and feelings, then you can be present with people who are suffering without having to rescue them and without having to do any internal defense mechanisms. You can show up in a fearless and compassionate way. And there's something very, pardon the pun, healing about that. And I think that's sometimes what's helped a lot of my clients too, is when they spend time with me, they can genuinely sense and experience that I have no fear of their experience, and I'm able to connect with them and to be completely present with them, and that often opens up a new space for clients as well. You know, some another kind of key idea here, in the work that I do is that thoughts and feelings in of themselves are neutral. You know, what you call grief in and of itself is not a problem. It's a natural. Of course, grief is a concept, right? It's but the experience itself is completely neutral. It's just part of the flow of life. And when people get stuck in these responses, it's usually due to fearing their own experience and not allowing themselves to feel it or getting trapped in it. And this is where things like psychoeducation can be extremely useful. Later on, if people are stuck and trapped in these old responses, it can be very useful for people to learn and to discover more about the nature of their own experience, so that they lose their fear of it, they lose their resistance of it, and life can flow again. Regarding the whole debriefing thing, if we talk about this in more conventional psychological terms, things like James Penbaker's expressive writing has been way more useful than debriefing. If someone's still struggling, let's say 6 weeks or 2 months, after the event, they haven't adapted, to then sit down and write down their innermost thoughts and feelings a few days in a row for like 15 to 20 minutes, that helps a lot of people to get closure, to structure their thoughts, to sort things, to to get perspective, right? A lot of what people call grief too is when people get stuck in it. There's a lot of what the perception of having lost something and what will happen to me and what does this say about me. There's a lot of identity stuff that's not necessarily seen as thoughts or thought created. That's often worth looking at as well. Uh, Psychologically speaking, though, I mean, some, grief, of course, is a perception of loss. And there is an identification, right? And I mean, sometimes, we humans, as Lisa Feldman Barrett often says, the main function of a brain is to manage the body budget and to predict its needs ahead of time. And we humans, being social animals, we kind of help each other regulate each other's body budgets, which is why social relationships and connection is so important. So sometimes there is a genuine loss in that sense. You've lost someone who plays a big part in what you invest meaning in and in regulating your own body budget. Like I remember working with an 88-year-old woman in the States as my oldest ever client who had back pain and who had a lot of grief. And she had been in a wonderful marriage. She couldn't praise her husband enough, and her husband had died a couple of years earlier. And I think they had more than 60 years together. They were they lived, they were so good friends. They had such a meaningful life together. They had such a strong friendship. They had their family, and of course, for a person who's 88 who then loses their life partner, like that, of course, he contributed to balancing her body budget. And there is a real sense of loss there in that way that psychologically speaking, at her age, she will probably never quite find another way to 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 have that. Simultaneously, if you look at it from the perspective of just consciousness and being itself, we haven't really lost anything. A final thing I would like to say too around this is if you attach to someone, if you identify with someone, and let's say they die, you will in all likelihood have a grief response. It's 100% thought created. I remember a female client once who got really angry with me when I talked about this. And I didn't talk about grief specifically, but she said, "Are you implying that if my 15-year-old son died in an accident, that my feelings wouldn't be a reaction to his death, that it's the result of thinking?" And I said, well, yes, but not quite in the way you think. And let me answer by asking you a question. If you had suddenly heard about some kid, age 16, in the north of Norway who died in a motorbike accident, what would you feel? And she said, well, that's. I said, what would you feel? And she said, well, nothing. I said, right, because you're not identified with him. So there's no. But in the case of your son, of course, there's, people die every day, without you necessarily having any thinking around that or any experience around that. But with your son, there are these stories of how he should have been able to experience this and he missed that and life should have turned like this and you've lost someone. And of course, all of that meaning making is 100% generated from thought. Now, that doesn't mean you have control over it. It doesn't mean that knowing that means that you won't feel it. You'll probably have some more space around it. It'll look less real, in a sense. I'm not saying that people shouldn't have, and I'm very sure. I have two kids. I'm very sure that if either of those died tomorrow, that I would have had strong responses of grief. On one level, I completely know that's made up. It's a thought-generated illusion. I'm still pretty sure that would still happen. And having done self-inquiry for many, many years, and that's the one, let's call it attachment, that I don't want to let go of. Like around my kids, that's where that sense of an I or a self arises quite strongly, and where I don't want to release it. I know with Gary Weber, who's a very well-known self-inquiry teacher, he says that if his daughters were to die, that would not have been any different for him than hearing on the news that someone else had died, because there's no attachment there anymore. There's no self-referential thinking going on for him anymore. So there wouldn't be any grief. Now, he kind of talks about this as a downside to some extent. he does make the point that he didn't release that attachment until they were in college and he knew that they were self-sufficient, and that's when he had that experience of self-referential thinking completely stopping. He does also make the argument that he thinks that he's a better parent in some sense because he can meet up with them and be completely present and really have no agenda for them, and that there's a freshness and an aliveness and a that arises from that. But for me, with relatively young kids, 6 and 12, when I've done self-inquiry, that's the one that now, we're leaving that one alone. And I think I think if you have young kids, you probably better have a strong attachment to them, and probably the price to pay for having that is that you will have a grief response. It's still completely made up. It's really interesting to, if you look at marriage, or parenthood. Like I can come home and feel an attachment, a strong love, towards my wife, and that's real enough and it's enriching, right? But simultaneously, the whole idea of my wife is generated from thought. She really has no existence outside of the thought process that makes her up. The wife that I experience in that sense is completely made up, and the I who has a wife is also completely made up. And it's really fascinating to see that as well, to be able to, and also regarding my kids, I can look at them and feel love and feel all sorts of stuff, and that sense of them being my kids, right? And if we took a biological test, of course they are, but simultaneously the I that claims these kids as mine is nowhere to be found. And the person, the personhood, or the I, the character that I project my kids to be, or that the thought process projects the kids to be, is nowhere to be found either. Now you could say, well, it's my DNA and it's my biological, yeah, but there's no I in that DNA, nor does that DNA refer to an I. So it's completely made up in that sense as well. There's probably a healthy balance to be found here in what sometimes is referred to as the middle way, as in, yes, it's all made up and it feels real, and you can engage with that in a functional way. And at the same time, you can also have the realization that this is all a thought generated hallucination. A bit like being a sports fan, or a Norwegian, or to have a particular occupational role, that you can have an identity as a sports fan or as a Norwegian or an American, or whatever, and you can feel a sense of community from that, and play that game. Or the same with time. You can show up at 12 o'clock on Zoom and have a conversation with someone. But it can also be the simultaneous recognition that there's no such thing as time. There's no Mondays. There's no Norway. There's no Norwegians or Americans. This is all completely made up. So, anyways, I hope these reflections were at least borderline interesting, or useful to you. As always, know that I see clients from all over the world. So if you'd like to connect with me and see if we could be a good fit in terms of working together, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Know that I'm doing a free webinar April the 9th, 6:30 UK time. You can find a link at provocativehypnosis.com on the seminar page. Until next time, thanks for listening.